This is TV Ate My Dinner. My name is Sean. I'm here with Lynn. Returning to talk horror films. This is going to be a good one. I'll probably do the TV in the Woods intro on this because we do try to separate those out for anybody.
Well, is that different theme music? I'll never learn the different theme music. I'll only ever know the one.
Yeah, it depends, and it changes a lot. I'm trying to think of what we were doing the regular in the last batch of videos, but we didn't have a TV in the Woods opening, so we'll see. But we've got the logo and the icon for TV in the Woods, so we'll push that playlist. But anyway, so we're going to talk about some horror movies tonight, and these are mostly new. I think these have something to do with each other, which I like, because the new Teenage Mutant, the new Texas Chainsaw Massacre just came out a couple weeks ago on Netflix. And
I watched it this morning, like an hour ago.
Good and fresh.
I'm still bathed in the blood.
And I watched Scream 5 yesterday, so I'm fresh on that one. So it'll be fun because I think these two are a good jumping off point to kind of talk about horror requels. And I was actually kind of gratified because in Scream 5 they actually called it a requel. I'm like, oh wow, we used to say that before it was a thing.
Requels. Well, they had also the same for it in Scream 4. Like, it's following the basic tradition that horror is these days, where they have one back in the 80s and then they keep soft rebooting or remaking or sequel, but not quite.
And that's kind of
over and over.
I mean, that's definitely the case with the Texas Chainsaw, but Scream kind of feels that way too, where it doesn't disavow the sequels, but you can tell it only really cares about the first movie, and it has the first movie's name. Like, that's the new thing where we just sort of reinvigorate the brand. And so this is supposed to be something that makes sense to a new audience as a new thing, but it's
there's no way that it could, because it puts so much emphasis on the old characters that there's no way you could walk into this fresh and just be like, this is fine.
I kind of wonder on that, because it does have, what's funny is we talked about this a little bit in our email prep when we were talking about it, and it's kind of a flawed concept anyway on the on their requel thing, because they get really into toxic fandom, and they even have like the meta stuff where they say, oh yeah, this was directed by Rian Johnson and everyone hated it.
Clearly, as you said, clearly a Star Wars thing, not a horror movie thing.
Which is interesting because they're going for a Force Awakens thing. All the rules that they're talking about are not rebooting horror movie rules. I mean, we'll get into the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because Texas Chainsaw Massacre, by the numbers, just copied the new Halloween reboot. Like, so that's really the one that set the actual standard.
It was so overt that Red was watching it with me and he kept on calling Sally Laurie Strode.
Because, I mean, like I said, we'll get to it, because they're not even pretending. Like, at least Scream is pretending that they've got a concept that, like, they're like really smug in the conceit of the movie. They're like, yeah, we got this. We're saying something, like the first Scream said something about movies, except everything you guys are talking about is fundamentally flawed because you're off genre. You're talking about how they rebooted Star Wars. This movie is following the Force Awakens template, even in the way you describe what they're supposed to do. We introduce a new group of characters. We introduce a new story, but it's still a continuation of the original story. We have to, at some point, once the story is off and running on its own, we have to stop the story by reintroducing legacy characters that aren't fully necessary for this iteration of the story. And then this movie starts all over again. And to your point, then it no longer works very well as a reboot, because new viewers, I mean, you get it from context. Like, you're not, I think a person's not ignorant of the concept of Scream walking into this movie, and if they've never seen it, but they treat it with more emotional weight than it would for a new viewer.
A casual viewer, yeah.
Okay, so I guess they were in the original, because people keep stopping to ooh and ah about these characters, so they must be something.
It's a legacy character.
Yeah,
well, it works better in Scream than in some of the other horror ones, because we have been following Sydney the whole time. It actually makes sense. I feel like it was done better in number 4, though, because she was actually a part of the movie beforehand. Like, she started the movie. So
I'm kind of torn because aside from like that criticism of the sort of structure that they chose, I did like this movie, and I have typically not really liked any Scream sequels. Like, I like Scream.
I love the Scream franchise. I'm a big Scream fangirl. It was the first horror I was introduced to as a little 12-year-old girl, and that's how I fell in love with the horror genre and how fun it can be.
And that's the dividing
much
line.
to my mother's disgust.
I'm just old enough that I could take or leave Scream. Like, I don't have to hate it because of my age, but I was, in college when Scream came out. I was already a little older than the target audience of that movie when it came out.
We loved it. We used to watch it every weekend, just over and over, like just fun for us. And it's such a good gateway to the old horror. I don't know why people would hate it. I know it's very different to what the old horror was, but it paid so much of an homage to it that it was actually the gateway that led me to older horror movies and led me to appreciate them. So
it's a Jaws factor. Like, if you remember just vaguely the franchise, you think, oh, those movies are awful. And then someone has to remind you, like, no, Jaws is a classic film by itself. Jaws is a great movie. Like, what
also
followed,
very good with the cat in it.
Yeah, it also created a subgenre that was bad. So, and Scream has a lot of those hallmarks where we don't thank Scream for what it brought to the table in the genre, because what followed Scream was a lot of subpar PG-13 teeny bopper slashers that
they kind of missed the point about what was good with Scream, which was not that it was PG-13. It was what it said about the horror genre and what it said about society and the fun characters. And I think that's one of the biggest things that's been missing from all the sequels, is they never got any characters who are as fun as those main characters in the first movie.
And it's weird how I just watched the first one right before we came on because I didn't have time to rewatch all of the Scream movies, but I rewatched the first one, and I think that's a good primer anyway, because it is funny how you take for granted that first movie makes it look easy about how you just establish characters with actors, because it was like it brought in that hip and cool horror movies. This is the horror movie for young people. Like, if you don't like horror movies, look at all these cool, sexy teens. And that's not, that's not anathema to horror films, but it's usually not successful in that way that it's like trend setting that people think the people in the movie are cool. Cause they're usually made by like 30, 40-year-old men who are like, you guys are teens, so you're cool. So just be cool teens. But this one just,
they cast cool 30 vibe. Or 40-year-old men, but
Yeah. I like seeing,
but they cast really good actors who,
like, they could just make a sequel with all the de-aging, just remake it with all the same actors.
Like, they cast really good actors. They had a really good back and forth. I mean, all of those actors like lived the roles and became people. It was fun. Those killers were fun. That's why we liked it, and that's why they get away with what they do with it, because it's silly. It's funny. A lot of the iconic bits are just like improv, which is not usually something you can do in horror.
It's one of those movies that if you watch again, it is kind of hilarious, because you're like, they did make it look pretty easy. Because if you watch these two dudes in the movie, you're like, how did you not notice that they're the killers? Because everything they do gives it away. But they're so good. And I think the new one is pretty good about this too, is they're pretty good at lampshading it to the point where at some point everyone's been accused of being the killer, and they've either brought it up too early or eliminated for some other reason that it never sticks out. And it's the same gag. It's like, what we do is the very first person that we accuse really is the killer. And that's the movie. But we have
it's always the boyfriend. Jesus.
Yeah, like that was Dewey's, like in the new movie, it really works. Like, who's this guy? How long have you known him? And it was totally true.
They do that in number 4 when she's when Sydney's there and the guy's being tied up outside, and he's like, no, let me in. And she's like, do you really trust this guy? Trust him with your life? Don't open the door then. And he is. She's right. She opens the door and gets stabbed. The only good, like one of the best characters in number 4, maybe one of the only good characters in that one. She should have stayed.
Well, one thing I think that this movie did, because I can't compare it very much with 4, because I saw 4 when it came out, and I was like, it's all right. And I don't want to watch
of all of the Scream movies before we went and saw. the most recent one. So
to give it its proper due, I probably should have rewatched 4 because those are the two to compare because it was a reboot. That's what's funny. It's like when they said that was 11 years ago, it's like, Jesus Christ, that was 11 years ago. It's like, yeah. Like
and they did the same thing. They had a bunch of nerds all saying this is a sequel and a reboot, and they give it all the names. Like they do all of that again, which is why it was a little jarring for me coming into number 5, which I enjoyed, but it was like we just did this in number 4. We already know about the meta stuff. It was way more meta in number 4. So trying to do it again here is kind of, we've done that. Why don't we just actually do a higher concept one or something like that?
I think they missed the boat that they missed on that was they really thought they had something, because it seems like whenever they think there's a moment that you can come back to and speak on, that's when they think we can make another Scream movie because like we have these horror movie reboots that we can speak to. And then somewhere in that someone said, oh, well, this is a good opportunity for us to talk about toxic fan bases. But if I can just defend, and the whole Scream series is a little bit to blame for this, but in my experience, the least toxic fandom I've ever encountered is horror fans. Like comparing horror fans, especially rabid horror fans, to toxic fan bases, like in this case, overtly Star Wars is the one that stands out.
Very overtly Star Wars, down to name dropping Rian Johnson.
Like, yeah, I mean, you're not even trying a little. Like it's obviously that.
Yeah. All the critique in this movie of toxic fandom is,
and people hated it.
Star Wars.
But it's not even a good commentary of that.
Pretty well accepted.
Because then when they show clips from it, it looks like the 8th Stab movie was a piece of garbage. So you're not even like, if you were saying that it deviated to try to elevate, but so you're not even trying very hard to make it an indictment of that situation. So you don't really have the commentary locked and loaded like you think you do for this, and it kind of fails on that. And then that made me rethink.
It was a bit of a mess in terms of that.
Because like the whole series
and the whole plot
toxic
line.
Horror fans that become psychos, like, because everybody falls on that to try to be like the original, which is not what the original was about. But it's like, if you're just taking a read, you're like, oh, these guys are nuts about horror movies.
Horror movies don't make psychos. Horror movies make psychos more creative. That's the whole thesis. It's Billy's thesis from the first movie. Like,
with those guys,
they were going to bring back something. It should have been that.
We were psychos, and that's why we gravitate to slasher tropes and that kind of stuff. But we're not to sort of flip that in this version and say, well, these guys are literally like rabid fans, and they're so passionate about these movies that it makes them psychos. It's like, first of all, that's not even true in the case of Star Wars ones, and they really are the toxic fans that you guys are talking about. And second, we haven't really seen an overlap in the horror genre. It's a completely different thing that you're I mean, if you're doing a meta commentary and you don't even understand the difference between genres, that's not. Like I said, I enjoyed the movie. That was one of
the reasons why the first one worked so well was because it was Wes Craven. Like he knows the genre. He is so deep in the genre himself that he knows it,
and it worked.
I find this science fiction more depressing with all of its horrible elements, where I can watch a horror movie where people literally get slashed up and killed, and somehow I find that more uplifting. Maybe because at the ending of most of these ones, somebody wins, and there's a clear like this person is the baddie. And this is aberrant behavior, not everybody's behavior. And people actually do try to stick up for each other in horror movies a lot of the time. And it's something that becomes uplifting.
I think, and that sort of speaks to my point about the horror fan base. The horror fan base tend to be, I find, more positive people. Because the ones we encounter, like, I don't want to paint everybody with broad brush, but what I'm saying is, like, there's the
odd bad one or two, but most of them are pretty good.
Dark or broody or depressive, but that's not the case at all.
And you find that with actors who go into horror and they get suddenly accepted by the horror community, and they go to conventions and people love them, and they're like, oh, I have found people who are loving and caring and warm, and where you can go into fandoms.
And it's a genre built around franchises that drive themselves into the ground. Like this is this idea that there's a one-off movie that everyone hates, and they're hating on the stars and the filmmakers. It's like, that's not the typical experience with horror movies. It's sort of the same thing, like you were saying. It's just like within the movie, where we start with a world where we know that we're not guaranteed to win, so it's not depressing when we see everyone get murdered, because we already know that's the world, and it's really just this sort of good versus evil, but evil can win. And we can relate to that, so we can take whatever good thing that we find in that. And it's sort of,
I think that's why, speaking to what makes sort of meta or satire work, why Cabin in the Woods works, because it starts with that premise and then says, maybe the win is not us getting away from the bad thing. Maybe the win is recognizing the situation and what we do and finding humanity in ourselves.
A superficial read of that movie would be that it doesn't get bleaker, because they basically just say, maybe humanity is not worth saving then, and just leave it. But what you come away feeling on that movie is like, oh, wow, there is hope for humanity, because look how they got it. Look, at the end, they're like, well, if we just are going to kill each other face to face for this sort of abstract good that you're saying, then what does that say about humanity? And it becomes
those two show the most humanity in not killing each other.
Yeah, and you could say, well, they caused the death of everybody. It's like, well, whatever. I mean, if that gun's
that's really important to what's happening. Yeah, background, as you said, they're in the world where that's happening. So what they choose to do and their humanity that they bring is why. That's why, contrasted with something like science fiction, it gets really depressing, because everyone in that one seems to be out for themselves and nobody seems to be helping each other, because it's a bad world, and that's how they're showing the world is bad.
Yeah, The Walking Dead principle. It's weird, because you would think The Walking Dead falls into the horror genre, but it feels like those guys don't get it. I don't want to be a gatekeeper, because I always am like, that's not real zombies. But I do feel like shows like The Walking Dead aren't really made by horror fans for horror fans.
Those really interesting creatures that it can be horror or it can be sci-fi, depending on what you're using them to represent.